The world is full of evil. Healthcare is a resource controlled and used as a bargaining chip by massive corporations. The money from one of the largest media franchises on the planet is being funneled towards the support of anti-trans movements. The UN recently declared a genocide is being conducted by Israel against Palestinians, one which an alarming amount of people would support. And worst of all, Nintendo charged $20 for mediocre Donkey Kong Bonanza DLC. Yeah, these things are definitely the same. I'm gonna be honest, I never thought I'd be the type of content creator to directly call out another creator's video, but recently I saw a video title that really caught my eye. It's by a creator called Lord Frogmire, who I don't think I've ever seen a video from, and usually I just pass by a video that's very clearly complaining, unless it was about something I myself wanted to hear complaints about. And seeing as my views on the Nintendo Direct were largely very positive, and I'd already seen just about every complaint there can be on Reddit, I almost passed this one up entirely. Watching that kind of thing is not something that's going to be productive to my day. It will just get me unnecessarily annoyed about someone else's opinion, and there's no need for that. But it's something about the title of that video that caught my eye. The Switch 2 is evil. Evil. Huh. This could be something to behold. What I was greeted by was honestly worse than I even thought it was going to be. I don't know how someone can take a reasonable point of view and express it in such a way that it makes it seem unreasonable and, at times, objectively incorrect, but here we are. I am not shy of voicing my opinions, but I also try to be aware of the fact that my viewpoint is always going to be tainted by my own biases, as will anyone's. So the fact that this video is so unhinged that I feel emboldened enough to actually call it out, that's when you know it's bad. A few baseline things I want to go through before actually getting into the video itself. I do not claim my opinion to be the right one. No matter how strongly I state it, I'm trying to keep as much balance in my mind as I can. That said, I do generally tend to verge on the side of positivity with a lot of things, and particularly with Nintendo. That doesn't mean I'll always think everything Nintendo does is amazing, but I enjoy playing Nintendo games, and when I enjoy things, I like to be in communities with other people who enjoy them. And sometimes in those communities, people are kind of a downer, so I may at times amplify the positivity. So yes, I will be very critical of this guy saying the stuff that he's saying, but not because I want to defend the billion-dollar company. Lord knows they don't need the help. With that said, there are some reasonable complaints, and I will try to highlight those as and when they pop up. I am also aware that a lot of this is almost certainly rage bait. I don't doubt he has issues with Nintendo, but it certainly feels hyperbolized for the content. At least that's what it seems to me. There are certainly people out there that believe these views just as strongly as is expressed here, but my instinct is that he's found a style of content that gets views and is rolling with it. While his video with the most views isn't one complaining about Nintendo, many of the runners-up to that title are, and that's incentive. Then again, most of his videos are driven by negativity, so maybe he just likes to complain. I also want to point out I haven't watched any of his other videos. I don't think I could take another one, so maybe I'm misrepresenting him, but, come on. Of course, making a video about this could just give him more of the attention that he appears to crave and, in my opinion, does not deserve, but, come on, that's not happening. My channel is way smaller than his, and he's already a relatively small YouTuber, so I can make a video criticizing him fairly guilt-free. And if he ever saw this video and decided to respond, he'd be punching down, so it's a win-win. Also, for the sake of not making this video way longer than it needs to be through just playing clips of him talking all the time, I'm going to cut around the bits that I need to show and don't need to show. I don't feel the need to say something about everything, but I also don't want to feel like I'm taking Frogmire out of context. I'll do my best to represent the points he's making, but it may be an imperfect process, so bear that in mind. Okay, I think I'm ready to start this. Brace yourselves.
Nintendo has been playing the villain now for a long time.
Okay, so first things first. The beginning of the video is just bafflingly poorly edited. Half of the first word he says is cut off. I've made, 50 videos now. I've never had an issue of cutting myself off in the first second of any of them. It's just alarmingly sloppy. Now, to be fair, he isn't the only person I've seen do this, and I guess I could theorize that maybe it's a deliberate way to manipulate the YouTube algorithm. When you see the preview of a video on YouTube before you click on it, and then you actually click on it, the video starts from where you saw that preview up to. But that will make a lot of people rewind because they want to hear the entire sentence in one. I know I do. So starting a video with what sounds like the continuation of a sentence from where a preview ended will make people try to rewind and see the beginning that they already saw. And maybe that will do some YouTube algorithm shenanigans and make it more likely for the videos to perform better. I don't know. That's just a guess from someone who doesn't know much about how to game the system, clearly. And it's probably just poor video making, but even if it isn't, that's not better. Not only does it show that he's willing to compromise the quality of his video for what will likely be the tiniest bump of views, but if he's willing to manipulate the algorithm and his viewers like that, then it paints a picture of someone that has the potential to be inauthentic or try to manipulate the system in other ways, like deliberately rage baiting and presenting inauthentic opinions in order to get more views. I mean, that's my theory, but again, probably just poor editing.
Gamers have rightfully criticized EA, Ubisoft, Blizzard, Activision.
Really? People criticizing Activision Blizzard? Never! I can't imagine a single reason that company would have been heavily criticized over the last few years. I know Frogmire specifically trying to make the comparison in terms of their monetization practices, but when you name a video this, and the first 10 seconds mentions a company that infamously allowed a large amount of sexual misconduct to occur within its walls, you just make your own argument laughable. We've seen what truly heinous companies look like. You mentioned them. Nintendo, on the flip side, is known for an incredible staff satisfaction rate, which means that at the very least, they are not even in the same stratosphere in terms of evil game companies just because they charge a little bit too much for a game you don't have to buy.
Let's talk about the new Pokemon, which has a day one on-disc DLC.
5 seconds. 5 seconds is all it took into him talking about Legend ZA to say something literally, objectively wrong. I hate using the word objectively because it's used in the wrong situation most of the time these days, but this is the right time to use it. So, day one DLC. I was unaware that day one of a game's launch extends for 4 months these days. This is a common thing people have been saying, that the DLC is day one DLC. It's not. It was announced early, but it launches in February, and the game comes out in October. There's no definition of day one DLC that covers what they're doing with this game. Okay, just for the sake of completeness, I wanted to jump in here from editing. This is actually the second edit I'm doing, but the first one is going to come later, so look forward to that. But yes, I recently had a discussion with someone where they pointed out the fact that actually, technically it is day one DLC. And the reason for that is because the first wave of the DLC, basically on launch adds a costume. I think 2 costumes. I think one is male styled, one is female styled. So technically, yes, it's day one DLC because that releases on day one and just the rest of the DLC releases later. That may well be true. That doesn't change really the argument because the actual bulk of the DLC, the bulk of it, is not releasing on day one. Okay, the bulk of the DLC is what they would have spent the time on. The reason that the DLC is not coming for launch is because of that bulk of the DLC that can't be made, that early. So yes, maybe they did cut some content and make that a costume. Fairly small deal, really. It's just 1 or 2 costumes. Even then, there is a very, very good chance that they made the costumes specifically for the DLC. There are probably other costumes that will come with the DLC, and they just, made one of those an early bonus for the DLC. So it's also not a pre-order bonus. This is technically, it kind of does act as one. But technically, I believe you will be able to get it even if you don't pre-order it. So just another thing that I was saying that was, supposedly wrong. But yeah, so I just wanted to be very clear about that, because I know that from what I've said in the video, it's actually a very specific hole in my argument. But I just wanted to make clear I am aware of that, and it's kind of less of a hole than you might think it is, because it doesn't actually change the foundation of what I'm saying. Okay. This also goes for the claim of it being on-disc DLC. No, the DLC is likely still being developed. Probably in the closing stages of development, but it certainly isn't something that could have been in this game for launch. Now, this doesn't invalidate his point inherently, but when he's using that as a point of emphasis, it kinda makes him look a little silly. It makes his outrage seem out of ignorance and jumping to a conclusion based on faulty information rather than anything. I also feel like people don't seem to consider the possibility of why Game Freak has actually done this. Sure, as he goes on to say, it is tone deaf, but remember that the full list of base game megas has already leaked, which has taken the wind out of the sails of the game a little. Announcing the DLC early means showing off not only 2 new megas, but also 2 of the most marketable they could have shown. When the DLC is announced doesn't change when the DLC could have been released, or whether it could have been in the base game. They very well could have waited until a couple of weeks after the game launches. The reaction would have been basically fine, and the DLC still could have released at the same time, which calls into question whether the reaction is really because there's something wrong here, or just people letting their perception of it be skewed by a weird announcement time. But there's one thing I want to point out about all this that really shouldn't be overlooked. This isn't Nintendo we're talking about. The Pokémon Company is a joint venture owned in a three-way split by Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc. Nintendo has a sizable cut of Pokémon, but isn't actually involved much in its development, if at all. They do largely seem to let Game Freak get on with it, and whether they should or not is another matter, but blaming anything development-wise on Nintendo feels very presumptuous. We don't know that they had any control over whether the DLC was cut content from the game. In fact, it would largely seem that they didn't. People often miss this though because they see Pokemon and assume Nintendo is the problem because Nintendo is who they already have the axe to grind with.
They're already in trouble. People are already upset about the Pokemon Power lawsuit. And really, it's not even the lawsuit that's upsetting people. It's their aggressive patenting, that they're using the patent office, which is supposed to be about a scientist or an engineer being able to make money on their inventions. Now it's being used to hoard game mechanics that they did not invent and do not own, but have the money to defend so that they can destroy any competition.
Now, this kind of feels like a tangent, but we have to talk about the Palworld situation. If Nintendo tries to use patents in order to squash any competition, that is bad, absolutely. Abuse of patent law in order to go after smaller companies who aren't doing anything wrong is a bad thing to do. I have to clarify this as my stance, because I know people will assume I think this is something Nintendo has the right to do. I don't. That I am defending them on this topic is because they so far have not done any of what Frogmire has claimed. They've been using their patents to go after Palworld, but they're going after Palworld alone. A lot of people who have issues with Pokemon or Nintendo like to deny it, but the evidence that Palworld used Pokemon assets in their game is just impossible to deny. They may have altered them, but they largely just stole from Nintendo. They just did it in a way that Nintendo can't do anything about because they covered their tracks just enough to be legal. But in a world where AI is sparking issues due to the fact that it's a form of content theft, to defend Palworld for doing the same thing just probably without AI feels really weird. Until such a time as Nintendo tries to sue anyone other than Pocket Pair, it's incredibly clear that their beef is only with Palworld. They don't want to nuke the competition. They've supported other creature collector games in the past. They just don't want to let a company profit from stolen assets and plagiarized designs. So they found a loophole, a way they could get at Pocket Pair. Pocket Pair abused the copyright system to their benefit, so Nintendo abused the patent system to get back at them. Whether that's right or wrong is another matter, but I for one am not going to cry any tears over Nintendo going after a company with a history of doing this. People keep saying Nintendo's going to try screwing over indie companies, but they've yet to even suggest they're going to attempt that, and we know they probably won't. You know who has? Pocket Pair. I don't understand patent law, but from what I've heard, what they've patented just isn't anywhere close to what people, Frogmire included, are suggesting. It's not just the idea of using monsters to fight other monsters. It's a specific chain of events during gameplay that realistically only exists in a game like Legends Arceus. Anyone making a creature collection game will be fine, as long as they don't actively try and copy Game Freak, something, they shouldn't be doing.
These are not defendable patents. They're being used as a weapon to drown the enemy in legal costs to force them to just give up.
This is entirely correct. That's what they're doing. But you have to be actively ignoring the evidence to actually not realize why they're doing it and why Pocket Pet is not the good guy in this situation. The fact that Nintendo is only doing this to someone that has actively wronged them kind of demonstrates that they aren't abusing this for control, not in the way everyone's suggesting anyway.
It is suppressing competition and will end up with less interesting games and worse games. Do you really want to live in a world where developers are afraid of using any game mechanics that even tangentially relate to something that's been in a Nintendo game?
Let's ignore that, again, that isn't how the patent law works. The question is, would you want to live in a world where whenever an indie dev makes something, they'll have their work essentially stolen by a bigger fish? Because if Pocket Pet ends up winning, many similar companies will be emboldened to do just that. We do not want to live in that world. Creativity in the industry has been fine since the lawsuit. No one's worried about it because anyone with any sense can see that the issue isn't making games similar to Nintendo, it's literally taking their stuff, changing it up a little, and selling it as their own. And no self-respecting developer is actually thinking of doing this. I want to reiterate, if Nintendo does abuse patents against smaller studios en masse, like is being claimed, that is wrong. But that's not what's happening, and with time I have no doubt we'll see that that isn't going to happen.
Could you imagine if Dark Souls got sued for being too similar to Zelda? Like, oops, you used lock-on targeting, and that's in Zelda games. Now From Software gets sued into the ground. No more Elden Ring, no more Sekiro, no more Dark Souls 3.
Yeah, but they aren't doing that. You bring up a hypothetical example, but you undermine your point by claiming Nintendo can do this when they aren't. Either they can't and you're just overblowing the situation, or they can and are choosing not to.
So on the back of this, of Nintendo saying only we can make Pokemon games or anything even slightly similar to Pokemon,
I don't want to keep harping on the same point, but they aren't doing that. Do you know how many creature collection games are on the Switch that have been featured in Nintendo Directs? They don't want a monopoly on the genre. They never have, they never will.
Here's our new Pokemon game, and it's not even complete. It's not complete on release.
It's interesting that he can claim a game is incomplete without it being released. How do you know? We don't know what content there is. Is it just because it has DLC? Are you saying that DLC shouldn't exist? That content should just disappear and we should never have gotten it? No, of course you aren't. You're saying that it should have been in the base game, even though it never would have existed if it wasn't DLC. Again, if they don't make DLC, it doesn't mean we get more base game content. It just means we don't have DLC. I know people have had gripes with the post-game of recent Pokemon games, and that's valid, but the gutting of post-game has been happening well before DLC was a thing. In fact, we know why that is. It's because they found that most players don't actually play the post-game, and I'd imagine they want to save the resources they would have put into that. Now, criticising that is definitely valid. They should put more effort into their post-game for those players who would enjoy it. But the idea that the reduction of base game content is linked to DLC is simply false, and the idea of DLC somehow meaning that a game is not complete is unrelated. We know what DLC is. It's essentially a stand-in for third versions, not post-game, and people don't consider games like Gold and Silver or Ruby and Sapphire to be incomplete. Their third versions just add more content. That's what DLC is.
But in the newest trailer for the new Pokemon game, whose main selling point is a new Mega Pokemon, they showcase 5 new Megas, none of which are available to you if all you buy is the main game.
Okay, this is par for the course. Now, I'm just going to quickly mention again that this is not Nintendo's doing, it's Game Freak, but beyond that, it's par for the course, and frankly, really quite tame in comparison to what Game Freak has done before. Not getting certain Megastones isn't ideal, but it's really not that big a deal. There's only a few that would be missing, and it's only really going to be for the collectors who really want them, or maybe people who just love those Pokemon. But it also isn't the end of the world to just not be able to get them. And again, this is a very tame example. Scarlet and Violet made you have to get both sets of DLC to be able to get Pecharunt. X and Y also had version-exclusive Megastones. Heck, version exclusives have always been a thing, and without a friend to trade with you, you'd be unable to get a Glammeow if you bought Diamond. Take it from someone who knows. In that case, my only option was to buy an entire game that is basically the same as the one I already have, or go without. And that's for actual full Pokemon, not just alternate forms. Sure, you could trade them over if you have a nice friend, but you can likely do that with the Mega Stones too. You certainly could before. And that goes for the DLC stones as well. When previous games got updated for DLC compatibility, you're actually able to get Pokemon from it via trades. So I imagine the same will apply here, which is actually fairly pro-consumer, all things considered. And third versions are even worse. If you had Diamond and wanted to get your Shaman in that awesome Sky form from the movie, nope, out of luck. That's locked to Platinum. And Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, geez, that was the worst. Having Blacephalon, Stakataka, Poipole, Naganadel, and Zeraora locked to the Ultra games, whilst original Sun and Moon adopters were left out in the cold. That was way worse than what's happening here, not just because it involves locking 5 dex entries rather than just forms, but because you can't get them in your Sun and Moon game via trading. To this day, Zeraora is the only Pokemon I don't have the regular form of. I have the shiny, but I don't have regular Zeraora, and that's entirely because of how third versions were handled. And that's why the DLC age has been so much better. Because anything you can't get, you can find a way to get if you look in the right places. Heck, you don't need a premium subscription to Home to use GTS, so you can get most Pokemon these days even without DLC, although that admittedly doesn't help much for the Megastones. And I want to once again point out, Nintendo don't make these games, so blaming Nintendo for this is weird. Sure, they set the price for NSO, but that package has so much value at this point for an incredibly low price that at this point it's an uphill battle to try and call that greed. And either way, does Game Freak, who, once again, are the ones making the games, actually benefit from Switch Online at all? I assume they don't get a cut of that, other than maybe a small one from the games they have on the system. But realistically, I doubt they have much incentive to push the online service that hard. They probably didn't think it was anything more than a fun way to offer out megas. Is it actually going to be fun? I don't know, but I don't think they had dollar signs in their eyes with that specific decision. With that said, would it be better if these were not locked behind ranked mode? Yes, obviously. I think it's a valid criticism. But when people say that this demonstrates that Nintendo are greedy or that they're evil, I'm like, no. It's at most a little bit annoying and kind of disappointing if you love one of those Pokemon, but it's not worth losing much sleep over, and there's probably ways around it anyway. I also want to make the case that this is likely going to affect very few people. The number of people who are in the very specific case that they are a massive fan of these Pokemon specifically, or want to 100% complete the game, but also don't own Nintendo Switch Online, is relatively low. Especially because people who are that obsessive about Pokemon are probably already the types to play online, or have a home subscription, or are super into Nintendo stuff already to the point that they have already got the subscription. This is very clearly not a method to push subscriptions because who the heck is buying Nintendo Switch Online just for Mega Chestnut? This is clearly a bonus for existing NSO members, and heck, again, I don't even think it's that because I doubt they really thought too much about the fact that you'd need to have NSO to do it. I imagine they just thought it would be a cool unlock incentive. Whether it is or not is another matter, but it's such a small issue that I can't imagine why it's getting this reaction. I also kind of get why people are more outraged about this than the DLC, because DLC in Pokemon games tends to be worth the price. But if the Mega Stones being unobtainable is the biggest issue the game has, we're doing pretty alright.
And they are not obtainable in any other way, meaning they're also limited time.
And here we have another pretty understandable criticism. Yeah, being limited time kinda sucks. They did this with Walking Wake and Iron Leaves as well, and honestly, I actually missed them the first time around because I just forgot. But Game Freak also recognises this, which is why they offer it multiple times. I do have a Walking Wake and Iron Leaves because eventually they came back around, so I was able to get them. So while they are limited time, you'll almost certainly be able to get them at a later date. Also, limited time distributions have existed since the dawn of the franchise. And again, for some of those you had to buy a whole game that you either didn't actually want or that is basically the same as a game you already own. So it's not even like the price here is the problem. All that to say, this is something that can be criticised, but the narrative that Nintendo is now evil for doing the same stuff that's been happening for 3 decades is just odd. Especially as, and I cannot stress this enough, it isn't even a Nintendo developed game.
And God forbid you just don't like ranked mode. You know, Pokemon, a baby game. Sorry, little Timmy, your favorite Mega for your favorite starter that you think is really cool, you just can't have it because you have to face against the 30-year-old virgin sweat lord whose soul is filled with plastic.
Okay, so a few things here. Yeah, again, tying it to a ranked mode could be a genuinely good criticism. I have no interest in ranked mode. The idea of having to do that is just a bit tedious to me. However, we also don't have any details on what we actually have to do to get the stones. It could indeed be that we literally just have to participate a single time to get the Mega Stones. This criticism will feel a lot clearer when we actually have some details. But I also want to pick up on the kind of dumb presumptions he makes. Firstly, calling it a baby game. I know some people equate bright colours with baby media, but Pokemon and actually a lot of Nintendo games are never designed to be for children specifically. Kids are a definite consideration. They want to make the game kid-friendly because then they get the kid market. But have you seen how large the adult community for Pokemon actually is? It's massive. And yes, Game Freak absolutely caters to that audience, not just in the games, but in other media too. The games are given a lot of depth in terms of mechanics and options because that's what seasoned veterans want. It's why the competitive scene is so big. So assuming that it's just for kids is just wrong, especially this time around. Legends Arceus was notably definitely more of an attempt to hit a more mature audience, not by making a game that kids can't play, but certainly making one that hits a lot of the things that people want in a AAA game that adults play. It's certainly not close to that level yet. But Legends Arceus was a clear attempt in not just gameplay, but general tone and atmosphere to create a more mature Pokemon game. Legends ZA is essentially the follow-up to Legends Arceus, and appears to do a lot of the same things, taking on a version of the type of action-based gameplay that you would see in much more esteemed RPGs for adults. Again, ultimately they want to keep the kids around, but that's very clearly not their absolute priority with the Legends games. Also, little Timmy will be fine. What kid's favourite Pokemon is any of the Kalos ones? Greninja might have a shout, as it's always been popular, but we're closing in on a decade since Greninja was actually relevant to basically anything. I think it's safe to say most of the people who have fond memories of Greninja are probably in their late teens or 20s now. And Delphox and Chestnut have really just gotten nothing since their debut. Can I also just comment on the irony of spending 20 minutes complaining about Nintendo games and then calling other people virgin sweatlords? I mean, I know I'm not one to talk, but heck, I own it.
Remember when Pokemon games were $30, $40 for what I believe to be the best the series ever had to offer?
How do you have the gall to make this point while specifically showing Emerald? If you already bought Ruby or Sapphire, you'd have to pay the same money again for basically the same game. Now, you can argue about the fact that the price was lower then, and you're not wrong, but I'd also argue that what you were getting for the price was not worth the value of paying the same price for basically the same game again, and while I'm no financial expert, I would absolutely imagine inflation accounts for at least part of the price increase. But I also feel like people don't acknowledge that Game Freak could still be doing that. They could still be releasing third versions that are the same price as the first games and make some alterations, but not enough to justify the price. Arguably, the fact that games like Emerald even existed was incredibly anti-consumer, and moving from that towards DLC was pro-consumer. And heck, if you want to argue that DLC is just a sign that the games were unfinished on launch, so are third versions. Heck, so is Emerald specifically. Viewing Emerald as an example of good consumerism is, well, mostly nostalgia. But it's also just a symptom of not understanding what third versions even were, and not understanding that the game only existed because they knew they could have gotten away with charging people for a game twice, while actually only really offering one game. This is what I'm saying. The logic isn't consistently applied here. That's what bugs me more than anything. And before you try to claim they didn't lock any Pokemon forms away from you in Emerald, yes they did. Gen 3 specifically locked forms of Deoxys to specific games, and there was no way to trade them in either, so again, that was definitely worse than what we have here.
Who knows, they might have cut out 10, 20 new Mega Evolutions just to feed to you later. A slow drip of deliberately cut content just to keep you paying. This is something that was so universally hated that even EA gave up on it. Nintendo is objectively a more anti-consumer company than EA.
Okay, I'll admit, I've genuinely not been keeping up with what EA has been doing, but if the idea is that cut content as DLC is a strategy, it still presupposes that the DLC is cut content. And given that, via the Terra leak, we know ZA was meant to release last year, but was delayed to come to Switch 2. We know the game has been finished for a while, the main game that is. They've likely spent the last year working on Switch 2 enhancements, as well as the DLC. That long working on the DLC means it's probably close to completion, but it was always likely planned as DLC, and so they'll sell it as DLC because, I imagine their budget for the main game and the DLC accounts for the fact that they'll be releasing the DLC as DLC. They would legitimately be cutting their feet from under themselves by deciding to just make it base game content. But also, isn't the main issue with EA the aggressive use of microtransactions, particularly loot boxes that promote gambling, as well as releasing a game that is basically the same every year with new 3D models for new players? The latter of which is basically what games like Emerald and Platinum used to do. None of that is relevant to Game Freak or Nintendo. Heck, Nintendo actively decided to remove gacha elements from Mario Kart Tour, relatively unprompted as well. They tried it out, and then made an actively pro-consumer decision that honestly made the game better. Nintendo does not belong in the same breath as EA, when their biggest crime is that they charge a lot of money for stuff. Objectively more anti-consumer than EA might Arceus.
And that's just Pokemon we're talking about.
Once again, keep in mind, not actually Nintendo.
Donkey Kong Bonanza, I liked it, it was fun, but it's been 2 months and we already have DLC. But surely it's something unique, a new spin on the formula? No, it's another roguelike mode. And it's not even a good one, they put no effort into this.
Bonanza is one thing I won't contest. That was a poor showing. The DLC does appear to have more depth to it than we first thought, but honestly, it seems to be more akin to Luigi's Balloon World than anything, so I don't feel comfortable saying that charging $20 for it is worth it. This is absolutely something I think is worth complaining about, even if, as someone who wasn't as into Bonanza as everyone else, I was not interested in DLC even if it was good. I don't have a rebuttal to this point, I just wanted to point out that this is the kind of thing that the criticism should have been focused around if this video had to exist at all.
I know there has to be at least a couple developers who still care at Nintendo, but the higher-ups are like, no, you have to make DLC, and you have a month to do it. So you either cut it out of the main game, or you make some worthless crap that is blatantly low effort.
Okay, I wanted to give Frogmire a win and get past the Bonanza section without cutting in, but what are you talking about? A month to make. I'm not a game developer, I want to make that clear, but I think I have more credentials than a guy who genuinely thinks they spent a month on this. All evidence points to the Switch 2 having been delayed for a year, and games like Bonanza would have been the games it got early on. So what we have as DLC has probably been worked on for a fair amount more time than a month. And do you think they work on a game up until it launches and only start working on DLC after that? My assumption is that the game is mostly done months before it launches, and then they have to start finalizing things like the marketing and shipping, as well as bug fixes, and I'd assume that during this process, the DLC would be worked on. So in the end, DLC almost always gets a lot of work done before the game even releases, and that still doesn't mean it could have been in the base game, because they would have to push the game release back because it will change when they can start marketing and shipping the game, or that they've already shipped the game by the time they finish the DLC. And yes, what we got is still pitiful even considering that, but the fact that an inaccurate claim is being used as the basis of a larger claim that Nintendo forces DLC to be made in a month is just not right. Criticize the DLC, don't then use that as a stick to beat Nintendo with when it's almost certainly unrelated. Nintendo can and has done excellent DLC for many of their games. This is one of the bad examples, but there are plenty of good examples.
Speaking of low effort, the Switch 1 had its library artificially inflated by Wii U games re-released on the Switch. This worked and people were okay with it because nobody bought a Wii U, so they felt like new games. Plus, the games got some improvements, they ran a little better, looked a little better. It was a pretty good deal. Now they're trying to do the exact same thing with the Switch 2. The difference is, everyone already owns a Switch 1.
Does this guy even understand the Switch 2 editions at all? I don't want to put words in his mouth, which is why I played that entire pretty long clip, but I can't see any way to read what he's just said other than that he believes that to get the additional content and improvements of the Switch games, you have to buy the entire Switch 2 version. The whole thing, the full price game. Let me make entirely clear, if you own Super Mario Bros. Wonder on the Nintendo Switch, and you decide to go and buy the Nintendo Switch 2 edition separately so you can play it with the improvements on Switch 2, you have no one to blame but yourself. The Switch 2 editions are pretty easy to understand. If you don't have the game already, you can buy the Switch 2 edition, but if you do own the original, then you can purchase the additional content for around $10 to $20 and download it like you would DLC. Because that's what they are. DLC. Bellabelle Park for Super Mario Bros. Wonder is DLC, and you can't claim it's cut content this time because it's releasing over 2 years after the game released. If you want to get this content, you're just basically buying DLC, and the overall package is more expensive, yes, but it includes the added DLC content. Frogmire seems to have some amount of disdain for the Wii U ports, but what they're doing here is actively more pro-consumer because it means we don't have to buy the entire game again to get the improvements. Back on the Switch, they released Pokken Tournament DX. I hated this because it had Darkrai in it, one of my favourite Pokemon, and I would have loved to play as the other arcade exclusive fighters, as well as Decidueye, but that amount of content for the price of an entire game is just not worth it. This was made even worse by the fact that they also added DLC. Now I was missing actually quite a lot of content that wasn't in the Wii U edition, but I couldn't justify buying it because it was still not worth the price for what I was getting. This is honestly just stupid. I always wished they would have done a Wii U DLC that would have added those extra characters. I would have happily paid that because it means I get to play the characters but without essentially buying a game I already had again. What they're doing on Switch 2 is basically that, and I think it's fantastic. It's breathing new life into old games, but without reselling us what we already own. I can't see the downside here. Some of them don't add much, but almost every single one adds visual and performance improvements, as well as at least one additional feature, be that mouse mode for Metroid Prime 4, the Nintendo app connectivity for the Zelda game, or a new mini-campaign like Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The only one that seems like it doesn't do that is, ironically, Legend ZA. It's just a performance and visual boost, as far as we can tell, and all the other updates that only do that are free, so why is this different? That, I think, is worth criticising, and yet Frogmire doesn't seem to realise this is a thing, and I don't get why. Well, I think I do. I think he's reacting to things on a very surface level way, and isn't actually looking into anything deep enough to understand it. He wants to hate it, and he likely wants to drive engagement by hating it, and this is why I really hate this type of criticism. I am a Nintendo fan. I love to be in the Nintendo communities and talk about things. That comes with the good and the bad. I do lean on positivity most of the time, but if I don't like something, I will complain about it. I complained plenty about Mario Kart World, for example, and I'm a massive Mario Kart fan. But because I don't have it in my head that Nintendo is evil and that I want to hate them, I will usually just not care about the more sensational things people complain about. I feel like a lot of people latch onto that because sometimes complaining is fun, but I feel like it's much more satisfying to take a measured look at something and form a more stable criticism than to just react and get mad over realistically nothing. We both have criticisms of the game, and they are valid, I want to stress that, but I feel like my criticism of it is just much more grounded in something a little more reasonable. I know that comes across as a bit of a snobby or even gatekeepy thing to say, but it feels like there's a definite difference in the way that we criticise the game, and it isn't in any way to do with the criticism I have being lesser in some way.
I would bet my life that the Switch 2 will never sell more than the Switch 1 did. So these aren't new games for anybody.
You realize that the highest selling Switch 1 game doesn't have even a 50% attach rate, right? There's always a market for older games. These are new for some people. We take it for granted as terminally online weirdos, but not everyone follows what is happening with Nintendo all the time. It's perfectly possible, hell likely even, that there are millions and millions of people who do not know what a Kirby and the Forgotten Land is, and never knew that it was a thing that released. So given the game DLC means there are probably people who will be caught in the net this time round. It gives more people a chance to buy a game that would have otherwise completely passed them by. And again, as this is essentially DLC, they can still make a juicy return on it from people who just buy the update, which they absolutely will. And of course there will be people who didn't buy the Switch. The console was incredibly successful, but there are billions of people who didn't buy one. And many of those people aren't ever going to be in the market for a games console, but there will probably be at least a few million who will.
So you're paying more for a game you already have for content you don't want if you have any brain at all, just so you can have any game to play at all on your new console, because the Switch 2 has no games.
It's funny to try and use the Uno reverse card on the PS5 has no games joke, because we are 3 months in and Nintendo has already launched 4 first-party games if you don't include Switch 2 editions. Now, granted, that does include Drag X Drive and Welcome Tour, which, while solid for what they are not system sellers, and Mario Kart World was disappointing, but the entire point of that meme is that the PS5 didn't just not have very good games, it actually had no games. Or rather, any game they have on their system is available to play on some other platform. Due to the Switch 2 editions, Nintendo get held up by that a little bit as well, but we already know that the system is going to get Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, Mario Tennis Fever, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, Kirby Air Riders, and Pokopia, and are going to be releasing within the next, 6 months? That is games, all of which are releasing only on the Nintendo Switch 2, and that's only the first-party stuff. There are also third-party exclusives. When you add in things like the Switch 2 editions and, heck, even things like the Virtual Boy and other Switch Online games, the amount of content the Switch 2 is actually going to have exclusive to itself, at least in terms of modern platforms, is staggering. It's so much that I even mentioned in my video about my thoughts on the Direct that I had to abandon my far-fetched dream of buying and being able to review every Switch 2 game because there's just too much stuff there. The Switch 2 not having games is just a disingenuous claim and only aims to undermine the Switch 2 in the same way the PS5 has been undermined. Only the PS5 kinda earned that title, and the Switch 2 has only just launched and already has so much promise in terms of exclusive content.
I guess the only real selling point is that the games run better, which really shouldn't be a selling point. You know, games used to run good on the console they came out for, always? Since when was a game supposed to come out and run badly? And be like, man, I sure hope they release a new console so the game I bought for my console I already own can actually run.
Again, a good point, if you could ignore that it usually isn't the only real selling point, but I do think it's worth noting that the Switch 2's unique feature of being able to be played in handheld mode does heavily affect how much you can really optimize a game to be able to run on what is essentially a high-end tablet. But, with that said, developers should always optimize for the system they're developing for, so it is actually kind of a fair criticism regardless, even if Nintendo's solution has been to make sure to include more than just performance upgrades if they expect you to buy the upgrade. Again, usually. It should also be noted that Nintendo games themselves don't tend to have performance issues. They usually have a very stable frame rate, with the Zelda games of the Switch being some of the rare exceptions because they are just kinda insane, but most other examples of Nintendo games with performance issues aren't actually developed by Nintendo. Mario Odyssey ran and looked great on the Switch, they just gave it even more of a bump on Switch 2, and they did it for free too because they didn't add anything else.
I mean, the optimization has gotten so bad that remakes run worse than their original game. Paper Mario in the Thousand Year Door on the GameCube runs at 60 frames per second, and then on the Switch, with its big new remake, runs at 30. What is going on? Why are people okay with this?
Because 30 FPS is largely fine. Games run fine and are perfectly functional at 30 FPS. 60 is better, but I feel like it isn't really necessary, and they probably went for great visuals over hitting 60 FPS, which I feel is a fine trade-off. But again, this is a fair criticism. I don't agree with it, but unlike a lot of other stuff he says, I can't say this is wrong. The level of anger it triggers feels unreasonable, but the actual criticism feels sound.
Now, I would never do this, I'm only hearing from a friend, but don't you think it's insane that a video game that is made for a specific console runs on an emulator better than the console it was made for?
I don't know why we're trying to compare likely a gaming PC to a Switch. I don't know much about emulation, but I assume that having a really strong PC is going to make games run quite smoothly compared to the Switch, which has to try and be a handheld console half the time. Some people probably don't like it, but I don't think anyone can argue that the Switch wasn't the right way to go for Nintendo and consumers alike, for so many reasons that I frankly can't get into right now because I want this video to end at some point. The Switch was never going to be able to run every game flawlessly because it is relatively weak. Emulation would always be able to do this better, and optimization is partially to blame for this, but it's just weird that we're comparing it to emulation when emulation doesn't have the burden of being a handheld console that holds it back in so many ways. But again, the benefits of the Switch form factor outweigh the disadvantage of being less powerful.
But no, keep being a sheep, eat all of the slop, buy the old game for the new console, because you have to fill that hole in your soul with something. You have to spend money to distract yourself from your worthless life.
Here we go, now we're getting into the meat and potatoes. I play and enjoy video games, so I must be a sad loner who has to rely on these things to distract me from the ennui I must clearly be feeling. For some people that might be true. For some people, video games add some value into lives that have little else going on, and that's a symptom of either a society that hates them or some pretty severe mental health issues, but whichever it is, it's really off base for this guy to be trying to demean those struggles. And I know that this is just meant to be an inflammatory tactic to undermine anyone who wants to argue against him, but I don't think that changes that it's a really awful argument to make. I don't currently suffer with poor mental health, and all things considered, I actually have a pretty good life. Video games just kinda enhance it. But I know a lot of people who do struggle with mental health issues, and I also know that for many of them, yeah, video games can be a source of comfort or escape. There's nothing wrong with that, and you blaming them for the fact that you can't pay bottom dollar for your video games is just a horrible thing to do, even if you don't mean it. I know I would probably get called a snowflake for this point, but that's about the most ineffective insult a person can use, and frankly, someone getting offended by DLC is just so much more snowflakey.
You have to spend money to distract yourself from your worthless life. Who needs any kind of self-respect when you have Bing Bing Wahoo?
The irony is that he's the one that needs Bing Bing Wahoo to... Okay, I don't feel comfortable claiming his life to be worthless, but I hope the point is obvious. It's clear projection. He's making a 20-minute video because he doesn't like that he has to pay for Super Mario Bros. Wonder DLC. I don't really see where he gets off talking about other people's lack of self-respect. I played Pokémon Violet and had a great time with it. Not my favourite Pokémon game, and I had criticisms, but it was well worth my purchase. Why does me buying and enjoying a game constitute lack of self-respect? Because it means I have no standards in games? That's not true. My standards are just different and aren't based around visuals or performance, unless it feels important to the experience, which it doesn't for a turn-based RPG. And that's just a really gatekeepy thing to say. You have no self-respect because you don't know what real games are. Like, no, I just enjoy different things to you. But the irony is, this guy really likes Nintendo games, as he all but confirmed he emulates, and it just feels really weird to me that people will complain about how bad Nintendo games are, and then just go ahead and play them anyway, albeit through an emulator. Newsflash, the reason people love these games still is because even through the performance issues, there's something undeniably fun, something you likely experienced when you emulated it. Some of us were able to see that even with the issues, and you weren't, and that's okay. But you don't get to act as if it makes you better than others when, by all accounts, it just means you're unable to look deeper into something. Which again, you don't have to if that's not how you enjoy games, but chill it with the superiority complex, okay?
And Bing Bing Wahoo Man you can now buy for $70. Yeah, 2 Wii games, $40 a piece, or $70 together. And it's the exact game with no improvements that will run worse than for free on your computer.
Again, the price of remasters is another fair criticism. It's still one I would personally counter. This is, by all accounts, considered in the conversation as among the greatest games ever made, is of a modern quality, especially when it's remastered, is as long as a modern game. $40 for that sounds relatively reasonable, and the same for its equally excellent sequel. And of course, you can buy them together and save $10. Also, just the fact that they're offering them separately means they are conscious of the fact that people did buy 3D All-Stars and are giving an option to buy only the bit you want, which is a pro-consumer move they didn't have to do but did anyway. But while I can personally see the justification for the price, I know not everyone feels that way. Again, I don't only want to comment on the things I think are outright wrong. Saying there are no improvements is also false. We know that this is remastered and comparisons have shown that. Plus you have the storybook. That doesn't overall counter the point he's making, but again, he is using either deliberately exaggerated or untrue language, or is actually just ignorantly reacting to something he hasn't even looked twice at. Or looked once at. They literally explain that there is additional content in the Direct.
We finally got more news of Metroid Prime 4, and it was the worst possible news. I didn't even know I was capable of being more disappointed, but here we are. In the Prime 4 trailer, which is probably the shortest of the entire Direct, they announced that Prime 4 is open world, or at the very least has an open world zone, with a whole motorcycle and everything. How could you possibly miss the point this badly? To not understand Metroid at all.
Okay, so this is actually really interesting, and I want to talk about it not necessarily to criticize Frogmire, but because there's actually an interesting discussion to be had here. I've never been massive into Metroid, but I loved Metroid Prime Remastered, and I think the open world element to Beyond is interesting. I can see why some people may think it's missing the point, because Metroid is often about the claustrophobia of being in tight, atmospheric areas that feel incredibly isolating and deadly. But I think the key here is that only one of those words can't really work in regards to an open world, and that's claustrophobic. The key to Metroid Prime, from my experience, is the isolation. Samus is a lone bounty hunter exploring a hostile planet. That can be an incredibly isolating feeling, especially as the original game had very little in the way of dialogue. All of this can exist in an open world, and you can try to bolster it by leaning instead into the agoraphobia angle. Plus, we've already seen that there are also much tighter areas more similar to what's in previous games. It remains to be seen whether this will actually end up working or not, but it's not something that's inherently flawed, and just dismissing it without any additional information feels very presumptuous, but again, it's a fair concern to have.
And don't even say, oh, maybe it'll be fine, maybe it'll be great, it'll be the best open world ever, because it already ruined another game. The open world ruined the new Mario Kart.
But maybe it will be fine. Maybe it will be great. Like, open worlds aren't inherently bad. We've seen some pretty excellent ones over the years, including some of the best from Nintendo themselves. With that said, they don't even lean on the open world nearly as much as Frogmire seems to suggest. Breath of the Wild and its sequel are a given. Pokémon Scarlet, but that wasn't Nintendo. Are the Xenoblade games open world? But they're pretty beloved. Does Bowser's Fury count? Even if it does, that game is awesome. And then Mario Kart World and now Metroid Prime 4. I might be missing one or two, but even so, that's not a lot, and they've been doing lots of other styles of game as well. Heck, the most recent Zelda release was a return to 2D Zelda, so it's not like they're laser focused on open worlds. Now, I will agree that Mario Kart World's open world was a misstep. An understandable one, but a misstep. Except the issue wasn't in making Mario Kart open world. It was the execution. There are plenty of ways they could have made it great, they just didn't do any of them, which sucks, but just because they made one bad open world game doesn't mean they can't make good open world games. We know for a fact they can because they absolutely have. Again, the criticism itself is valid, but it feels like the reasoning is screwed and the anger is just way beyond what it should be, especially for someone who says he isn't even the biggest Metroid Prime fan.
Now, if you just want to race on a track, 3 laps around a circle, well-designed, made for racing, you can't do that anymore.
This is another good point. I have absolutely no anger towards it because I don't care about online and I enjoy the connecting courses in local multiplayer. But Nintendo changing this was absolutely backwards and one of the most baffling cases of them actively going against the enjoyment of their fans. Hi, it's Editing Slade. I'm just putting a little bit in here because today, as I'm recording this bit here, Nintendo actually released a new patch for Mario Kart World. Now, again, I don't play online, so I haven't played it, I haven't tested it, haven't really heard, much definitive about whether this has fixed the issue or not. But this update does appear, at least from the patch notes, and from what people, at least when I saw, had started to play, it does seem to have started again to move it back towards lap races in terms of the online selection. Now, again, I don't know how much that has actually worked, how much it's improved things. But this is actually the second update where they've done this. So, while obviously the update that made them less likely was bad, now they've done two updates where they're trying to fix that issue. The first one, obviously, people didn't really notice the difference, so it seems they've done another update to try and fix that. And I would guess if it doesn't work again, then they'll probably do another update to fix it even more. So, while yes, doing it in the first place was anti-consumer, I'm not going to try and deny that it was. They're kind of course correcting now, which doesn't absolve them of the fact they did it in the first place, but it is worth noting.
Instead, you're forced to race on a straight line with nothing interesting, nothing cool, no obstacles, just a straight line. You're driving through traffic.
Okay, you lost me again. I mean, let's ignore that he's played a clip where you can very clearly see on the minimap that it's not a straight line at all. But there are many connecting courses that are much less straight than this. One video I was going to do was to go through every connecting course and count how many turns were in them, comparing them to how many are in the regular course they're connected to, and you'd actually be surprised by a lot of them. There also are absolutely obstacles, which are not just the traffic, but also things like hammer bros, or peepers, or piranha plants, all the things you usually expect in a course. Plus a lot of randomized stuff that can also happen. They aren't without flaws, certainly, and I think doing 3 laps at the end would make them stronger, but they're not just straight lines with no obstacles. That just isn't true by any standard.
Honestly, I'm just waiting. Maybe a month, 2 months from now, they're gonna sell a DLC that lets you play online on the tracks. I know exactly how they're gonna sell it too. They're gonna be like, here's the DLC with 10 new tracks, and when you play online, you can select a mode where if you own the DLC, you only race on the DLC tracks.
Anyone who's been paying attention knows that isn't going to happen. If they do include that option at a later date, it will be free DLC. Free DLC is something they do in their games a lot, and they did it on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe as well. And heck, in Deluxe they allowed you to play the DLC courses online, even if you didn't own the DLC. They were willing to go that far to appeal to the online players. The recent update is definitely not following that spirit, but I don't think that there's any reason to believe that Nintendo will lock an online option like that behind a paywall. That just reduces the amount of people that will use it and defeat the purpose of it.
And of course, the DLC won't include any of those straight line intermission tracks.
You don't think the DLC for the big open world Mario Kart game will have another portion of open world in it? I don't... Why? Why would they not do more open world stuff, seeing as it's the game's selling point? And no, it isn't because no one liked the open world. The DLC would have been in development well before the game released, for similar reasons as I mentioned for the Bonanza DLC.
You know, a lot of people blame Nintendo's transformation into EA on Doug Bowser, because Doug Bowser is the president of Nintendo of America, and he was an EA executive for 8 years, so it makes sense. But I think Nintendo's downfall has been going on a lot longer than that. It all began with the death of Iwata.
What? This is where he oversteps the line for me. This is where it goes from, damn, look at this guy's hilarious tirade about something that doesn't really matter, to, oh wow, you actually just don't care what you say, huh? As a general rule, we don't use a man's death as a way to score notches on our points card. You don't get to use Iwata's death as a way to dog on people for liking Nintendo games. His legacy should not be just losers on the internet using him as a martyr for the Nintendo they used to love. Fun fact, Nintendo was not perfect under Iwata either. A lot of the things he has criticised in this video, including DLC, started on the Wii U when Iwata was at the helm. This guy hates the Galaxy 1+2 reveal for the 40th anniversary of Mario. He would have hated what they did for the 25th under Iwata. The seemingly corporate sanitization of the Mario franchise was going on during Iwata's tenure and only ended after he sadly passed. And I'm not saying that Iwata was not a great man and a great president for Nintendo. He was. But there's this idea that Nintendo was amazing and wasn't focused on money while Iwata was alive, and no, that's not true. Again, there have been so many pro-consumer decisions made in the last decade, and I've already mentioned a lot of them. Mario Kart Tour's move away from gacha, the switch to editions as a better alternative to remasters, all the free DLC they've offered. If you insist on Pokémon being Nintendo's problem, then the move away from third versions is another. It's not like we lost Iwata and Nintendo went off the deep end. They made some bad decisions like they did before, and they made some good ones too, like they did before. That's it. This is now getting into just truly scummy behaviour, and I hope I'm not the only person that feels uncomfortable with him using this point.
We live in bad times. There are a lot of people who genuinely have nothing, who have no soul, who have no love, who have no family, and so they attach to their own childhood as the only thing they have left. And those people would rather die than see Nintendo as the evil thing that it is.
The hypocrisy of saying this and trying to pass it off somewhat as empathy after lambasting these same people for buying and enjoying video games is true cinema.
It also doesn't help that the developers just aren't the same people anymore. The people who made the games you love either don't exist, some of which are unfortunately dead, or so old that their brain is basically goo. Miyamoto, I love him, great guy. He has no idea where he is. You can just look into his eyes and see that nobody is home.
72 is not brain turning to goo age, and Miyamoto seems to be doing just fine. He is very clearly still passionate about video games, and even if he doesn't work on them as actively as he used to, he still appears to have quite the influence. But the funny thing is, he's also the same person people will go after for the supposed Mario mandates. Miyamoto is kinda old-fashioned in his views towards video games, and from what we can tell, it's often the new blood that has to struggle against some of his stubbornness in that. And again, he is rightly a legend, but the idea that the passing of the old guard is what's killing Nintendo does not seem to be the case. There are many talented and passionate people there still. Also, it should go without saying, but in the same way as weaponizing Iwata's passing, implying that Miyamoto is senile and suffering from dementia is just ew. And have no bones about it, that is what Frogmire is implying here.
If there was, he would have executed someone by now over the Mario movie. The Mario movie, which was the biggest announcement of the Nintendo Direct. You know, Nintendo, a video game company, who spent more time talking about a movie than an actual new Mario game, or at least given more time to Metroid Prime 4, or something else that gamers care about.
I don't understand what's wrong with Nintendo promoting the movie in the Direct. Even though it isn't a game, it's arguably their biggest release next year in their biggest franchise, and the people watching the Direct are indeed interested in it.
I mean, you knew it was over when they picked Illumination to make the Mario movie, a company incapable of making anything with any soul at all.
I feel like this guy is a little behind, because Illumination has somewhat been redeeming their image recently. Not just with their open criticism and mocking of AI and having a couple of actually decent films under their belt, but also because the Mario movie itself showed a massive improvement in terms of how much effort they're willing to put into the animation. The story was the weaker part of the film for sure, but they showed plenty of love to the franchise in the ways that people adored, and it even seemed that Nintendo was slightly more relaxed with how they allowed Illumination to present the film, such as letting them refer to the spiny shell as the blue shell, as one example. That's unthinkable in a Nintendo game, but Nintendo actually seems like they relinquished some amount of control, and while it wasn't a spectacular movie, what we got was a pretty good love letter to the fans.
But no, we get Illumination and Chris Pratt and Seth Rogen. Because you know, Seth Rogen, he's only in the best stuff.
Did anyone actually have an issue with Seth Rogen in the film? I remember people were apprehensive at first, but he ended up being a pretty fun character. And Chris Pratt as Mario was great. He didn't work for everyone, but the overall consensus for most people who watched the film was that he did a great job. He understood the assignment, and he became Mario. Can't say fairer than that. People forget that this isn't Pratt's first time voicing a happy-go-lucky everyman who appears to be completely ordinary, but with his courage and force of will, he's able to become extraordinary. Pratt had the credentials from the beginning, and the great thing is that he still made Mario feel distinct from Emmett and faithful to the actual character, relatively at least. This genuinely feels like criticisms that come from someone who has not seen the film, because he doesn't have any substantive criticisms beyond, well, when has Seth Rogen been in anything good?
Mario just is Mickey Mouse now. He has no attachment to anything real. He's not a real character anymore, just a symbol for a corporate entity.
What does this mean? Like, I get it, he isn't really a character, but like, when has he ever been? He's always been a very simple character with little personality other than pure joy. That's entirely by design as he becomes a player surrogate, but it really hasn't changed that much. In fact, the Mario movie gave him a bit more character to the point that some moments felt a little out of character. He's never really been a character. He's always been a symbol. This is just a weird misunderstanding of Mario. I also don't get the Disney comparison. I assume that he's talking primarily about the size of the company and the large amount of merchandising and outside media they're delving into, the latter of which doesn't really feel like an inherently bad thing, especially when they're doing things like the Rosalina storybook as part of the merch they're creating, which means a lot to a lot of people. But regardless, the comparison to Disney is not particularly apt because it misses one of the most toxic parts of Disney: monopolization. Nintendo doesn't do this. It doesn't buy other studios, strip them down, suck all the bits up that they think are useful, and discard the rest. That's Microsoft's deal. Nintendo doesn't do this. They rarely buy studios, and when they do, it's always meaningful. Nintendo works within themselves, strengthening themselves mostly from inside to keep creating quality content. Nintendo isn't comparable to Disney because of that one fundamental philosophy difference.
I think the only person with any soul or brains left at Nintendo is Sakurai, and it's just because he doesn't care anymore. He's like, okay, I'll make all the Smash games you want, but now you're letting me make my game, and I'm making Kirby Air Ride because that's cool. I don't care how many copies it sold.
What are you talking about? Sakurai didn't use Smash as a chip to get Nintendo to let him make Kirby Air Riders. Sakurai didn't even come up with the idea. Nintendo EPD and HAL Laboratories approached him about it. They asked him to make it, not the other way round.
And you just know the corporate Nintendo guys are just seething over this. They're like, he only gets to do this because he has to make another Smash game.
What are you talking about? They wanted him to make the game. They asked him to make... Guys, are you hearing this? This guy just gushed about how based it was that Sakurai got to make 2 directs and clearly didn't watch them, because if he did, he'd know that Sakurai did not make this game because he just decided he wanted to. He made it because the corporate bigwigs asked him to make it. Why are they going to be seething about Sakurai doing the exact thing they asked him to do? And no, again, don't get me wrong, Sakurai is a legend and he doesn't work on anything without being incredibly passionate about it. But the idea of Kirby Air Riders was born out of the corporate desire for Kirby Air Riders to exist. Nintendo brought back Advanced Wars, Endless Ocean, Famicom Detective Club, and another code on Switch. You think the idea to bring back Kirby Air Ride couldn't have come from that same company? And heck, look at the directs. Have you not noticed how similar they are to the Smash style of direct? You don't think at all that that was Nintendo's idea? To take an iconic director who used an iconic style of presentation for one of their highest selling games ever, and use that to promote a game from the other franchise that director is iconic for? You think that was Sakurai's idea? That's marketing gold because it will get suckers like you hook, line and sinker. You've spent this video bemoaning people who fall for Nintendo's greedy corporate tricks because of their reverence for their games, and you've fallen for the most obvious one because of your own reverence for Sakurai. Seriously, this is just hilariously unaware of him.
I think the lockdowns gave Nintendo a stimulus, that the Switch sold more consoles and more games than it should have.
My dude, the Switch was a record breaker before the pandemic. Now, sure, it probably helped somewhat, but the Switch existed for 3 years before the lockdown took effect and was already a phenomenon. I've genuinely never heard this line of argument because no one's crazy enough to actually use it. For Animal Crossing, sure, I'll grant you, but the Switch itself was selling like crazy whether or not the world closed down.
But we always have the third option, which is just whine on the internet and hope it gets better, which isn't as pointless as it sounds, because if you make it socially unacceptable to buy Nintendo games and just make Nintendo fans sound like losers, people won't want to be associated with Nintendo anymore, especially with how widespread the internet is now.
Again, is it not ironic to be making a 20-minute video complaining about Nintendo and saying that your aim is to make Nintendo fans look like losers? Especially seeing as you yourself appear to be at least a fan of their older games. Besides, I grew up during the Wii and DS era where it was socially unacceptable to be a Nintendo fan, where you were considered a loser for that. And yet, Nintendo managed to have arguably their best generation based on sales of the Wii and DS combined. Heck, even these days, kids do often regard the Switch as the baby console. Nintendo isn't cool, but they make games that people enjoy, so people buy it anyway. You can't shame people into not buying Nintendo games, and even if you did, the people you're trying to bully out of their personal hobbies because you want to be able to enjoy it in your own way are not the losers. Alright, so that's all of the points I wanted to address from the video itself, but there was one more point I've been saving for the end. The title of the video. Now, yeah, it's clickbaity, it's ragebaity, but it's reinforced in the video to the point that I actually think Frogmire genuinely believes Nintendo to be objectively evil, and while I'm sure he would be glad to hear that people think his words are genuine, he really shouldn't be when these are the words, because they make him look... I really do not like having to resort to ad hominem, but honestly, I don't see a better way to illustrate this point. It makes him look like an idiot. Now, that's not just a senseless insult. I'm not saying, I don't like you, so you must be stupid. No, I actually genuinely think that's a relatively reasonable takeaway from this, if these beliefs of his are genuine. And honestly, I think the comparison to Activision Blizzard that he invited right at the beginning of this video could be the start and end of it, but we can go a little deeper. Evil is just a really ridiculous thing to say about a game company in general without a greater reasoning as we do for Activision Blizzard, because these companies aren't evil for the most part. Evil, to my mind, is the knowing and intentional causing of pain or suffering to people. You can make this case about Activision Blizzard because, well, the allegations are pretty serious. But Nintendo isn't doing that kind of stuff. They're just putting high prices on their games and sometimes under-delivering on content. That itself isn't great, overblown as I think it might be, but it isn't evil. I do find another comparison Frogmire made to be more interesting though. EA. EA has always been the poster child for scummy tactics, but I still don't know if I would ever have called them evil, just a company with no class. With that said, EA and companies like that do put a massive emphasis on loot boxes and strategies that have been proven to contribute to gambling addictions. Gambling addictions do real disastrous harm to people, and these are being promoted in the industry. Does this constitute evil? Maybe, I don't know. Now, to be clear, I do know that Nintendo has dabbled in loot boxes, most notably Mario Kart Tour and, from what I understand, Fire Emblem Heroes. I assume a game like Dragalia Lost also had them, but the point is that they have done it. They have promoted these awful tactics. In fact, I believe Fire Emblem Heroes still has that system in place. That is, however, the only example. Most of Nintendo's other gacha-style games have been shut down or, in the case of Mario Kart Tour, the gacha elements were taken out. Yeah, they actually removed the big evil monetization element from one of their biggest games that utilized it. That still doesn't absolve them. Fire Emblem Heroes still exists, but it's something I just can't see most companies doing unless absolutely forced to. So this is what it comes down to for me. Nintendo's monetization is actually pretty decent most of the time. It's not perfect, and the prices are eye-watering at times, but they don't really dabble in many actually scummy tactics. With Nintendo, you typically buy a game for a fixed price, then maybe buy DLC, and that's it. Most companies have layers upon layers of different ways to monetize their games, often starting free, but enticing you in with all these exciting sounding ways to spend your money. That's not Nintendo, and they're better for it. Let's actually look at the games we're getting on the Switch and Switch 2. Metroid Prime 4, one-time purchase, no other monetization. Age of Imprisonment, one-time purchase, no other monetization. Mario Tennis Fever, Tomodachi Life, Rhythm Paradise Groove, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. These aren't things that are meant to draw you in and then squeeze your wallet when they already have you hooked. You pay money and you get a game. Galaxy 1 Plus 2, not only is it a one-time purchase, but you have the option to purchase the two games separately, which accounts for people who already bought 3D All-Stars. Mario Kart World was expensive and not worth the asking price, but they very specifically had a Switch 2 bundle that made it less expensive than most other games. Of course, when I say there's no other monetization, that doesn't account for DLC, but that's basically just paying an amount of money for more game. It's like buying a second, smaller game with a price that reflects that. They don't always get it right, as Bonanza proves, but usually you get value with your DLC purchases. And then there's the Switch 2 editions, which, as I said, is just a much more consumer-friendly way of doing the same thing they've been doing for years with remakes and remasters, but in a way that doesn't lock new content behind a full game's price paywall for those who already own the original. This isn't even talking about how often they offer DLC for free, something they absolutely could charge for but they don't. And this goes for many of the Switch 2 upgrades for Switch 1 games, which are also free. Do you know how many companies would nickel and dime you for all of that? Free stuff is relatively rare in the industry, unless it's a gateway to further monetization, so it being the norm in literally the biggest game company in the world is crazy. They've dabbled with other forms of monetization, but that isn't their bread and butter. I also want to mention Switch Online because holy heck what a good deal it's ended up being. A lot of people complain about the very fact you have to pay for online, and that is fair. I feel like Nintendo, as well as the other console manufacturers, mostly charge for online because upkeep of the service does cost them money and resources, but it's not as if they don't have the money, so yeah, another criticism I'm not bothered by personally, but I don't have massively compelling arguments to the contrary. Now, with that said, if you are going to charge for online, the way Nintendo does it is absolutely excellent, and at this point it's not even debatable that it's worth the money, even considering that it's a subscription that you're going to have to keep paying for continuously. Let's assume you're looking at the expansion pack on an individual level for a year. That's $50, which sounds like a lot, but that's over a year, and frankly, as someone who actually has the expansion pass family plan, it's actually still one of the less expensive subscription services I have. But the actual content you get alongside this is insane. With the addition of Virtual Boy, the service will hit around 350 games, although granted, Virtual Boy is its own separate thing because you have to pay for the headset, something Frogmire didn't mention at all in his video, which I'm kinda shocked about. But even without Virtual Boy, you still have almost 350 games, and that's a number that's growing. Games also almost never leave the service, with it only ever actually happening once up to this point. Beyond this, you also have games like Tetris 99 and F-Zero 99 included. You get access to multiple major DLC and a couple of Switch 2 edition upgrades, Nintendo Music, the Nintendo app. Like, if you were to tot up the value of just the games and DLC, it would be in the thousands. Now, let's compare to another online service, Xbox Game Pass. If you opt to get the Xbox Game Pass Core package, the low-end package, you can pay quarterly, meaning you'll have to pay around $25 every 3 months, which comes to $100 a year. This is twice the price of Switch Online, but unlike the full Game Pass package, this only comes with 25 games. Now, granted, I'm sure those are great games that would be worth the individual cost, but the point is that the Switch Online's top package, at least top individual package, is half the price of Xbox's lowest price package and has almost 14 times as many games. Now, of course, the games on Switch Online are often smaller games owing to being retro games, but not all of them are, and regardless of that, it's still worth noting that many of the featured games are beloved classics and sometimes among the best games of all time. On Xbox, you can get Game Pass Ultimate, which lets you play hundreds of games, and again, that is actually kind of worth it, but the price then goes to $20 a month, or $240 a year. That is almost 5 times the price of the Switch Online expansion. And games don't usually stay on Game Pass forever, which means you'll lose access to certain content unless you buy it separately. Not only is this not an issue for Nintendo, as only one game has ever been taken off the surface, but the library is constantly growing. It will eventually get to the point where there are thousands of games available on the service, and someday we may even see games from consoles like the Wii and Wii U make it on there, meaning genuinely modern standard games could be part of that subscription. All this to say, complaints about Switch Online are valid, but it's always going to be an uphill battle when there's just this much content for a comparatively rock bottom price. And yes, Nintendo does not have rock bottom prices on everything, but as I've said, if the worst thing they're doing is having a very cheap online service with lots of extra content, and then having expensive but typically high quality games and DLC, they aren't really doing that bad. So the idea that they're evil just feels way overblown. Heck, it genuinely feels brain dead as a take. This is why I say that it makes Frogmire come across as an idiot. They are open and upfront about what to expect from their games and DLC, and there's nothing hidden that manipulates people into buying a thing that they don't want to buy. The prices are expensive, but you don't have to buy them. Heck, I can criticize the Bonanza DLC, but I simply didn't buy it, and I'm happy with that. It isn't like what other companies do with their predatory monetization practices that hook you in. Nintendo is completely upfront about its costs. It's expensive, but that's also the nature of the industry, and is likely the case thanks to things like the American tariffs and simply the concept of inflation. None of that is specific to Nintendo, and the things that are specific to Nintendo are actually mostly good practices. Now, I'll grant you that the patent thing on paper is quite bad, and I can kind of see why Frogmire slaps the evil label on it, but even that feels like a harsh label, and it even kind of assumes that Nintendo is going after small indie studios when, no, they're going after one developer that has already wronged them. Again, if they do end up throwing their weight around with these patents, then that's bad. Not sure I would call it evil, but definitely bad. But I feel it's obvious that we don't live in that reality. But the stupidity of the evil label goes beyond just the fact that their monetization isn't actually that bad. I started this video by making hopefully obviously ridiculous comparisons between Nintendo's pricing and things like J.K. Rowling's crusade against transgender people or the Palestinian genocide. The reality is that using the word evil to describe a video game company charging more money than some people want to pay for their video games and accessories when we can see actual horrendously evil acts happening in the world comes off as a massive dose of privilege. I love video games an incredible amount, and they're core to who I am, but I also understand that they are not a necessity. They are a luxury. We can live without video games, objectively. If Nintendo was charging way too much money for medicine or food or even basic necessities like water, then that would be evil because they're trying to weaponize our literal need for those things in order to make money. But they aren't doing that. They're making video games expensive. And there's always that choice. That's why I just don't understand the complaints about price. Or rather, I do, but it feels overblown because, worst case scenario is either you pay more for a game than you would like, or you don't get to play the game, and that sucks, but it's also not going to have a big impact on your life. I mentioned earlier how I hated what they did with Pokken Tournament DX, but I just kind of didn't buy the game and moved on. I feel like that's the appropriate response, not trying to convince everyone that the people not selling you games at your preferred price point are evil. This is, in the end, why I wanted to talk about this video, and knew I wanted to from before I'd even watched it. Because the notion of Nintendo being evil is just ridiculous, but it's one I see expressed relatively frequently and not challenged nearly as much as you'd hope. Have reasonable criticisms, express them, these are good things to do, I know I do quite often, but can we leave the hyperbole and sensationalism out of it? I know this is a fairly negative video for me to be making, and not at all on brand, but I'm still just making whatever I feel like making at any given time, and this topic just fascinated me, so I really wanted to do it, and it's another type of YouTube content I can tick off the bucket list. This isn't going to become my whole shtick, but I hope you stick around and check out other stuff I've done, or like this video if you liked it, or dislike it if you didn't like it, I guess. Or comment about, I don't know, how I'm actually wrong and Nintendo employees routinely punch babies. Either way, I hope to see you in the next one.